Let's go to Canberra now, where political correspondent Gillian Bradford hosts our Wednesday politics panel. She's joined by Liberal Senator Gary Humphries and Labor MP Kelvin Thomson.
Gentlemen, thanks for joining us. Kelvin Thomson, we're 3 days now into this banking inquiry, and the harshest criticism of the government seems to have come from the smaller lenders, the very people you're trying to help. Does it prove that this is really all smoke, no fire, this package?
Oh no, Gillian, I think it's a really serious package. As you'll be aware, it's our plan that from the 1st of July next year, that new home loans will not be able to come with an exit fee, so that people who take out housing loans from that time on will be free to move their mortgages around without the risk of the exit fee and the financial penalty. I think that should be very effective in putting downward pressure on bank margins and helping home borrowers out. I also think that our package of support for the smaller lenders through the residential backed mortgage scheme is a very important scheme. There's been an additional $4 billion put into that, bringing that to a total of $20 billion, and we're very serious about supporting smaller lenders as a fifth pillar.
You talk about margins coming down. Ralph Norris was before the inquiry today, the CEO of the Commonwealth Bank. He says if they had not increased rates above the Reserve Bank rate, this is back in November when they came in for all that criticism, that banks would have gone into loss, their credit ratings would have been downgraded. That would have put us in the same basket case potentially as other economies, and he said, I rest my case on that. Isn't it time that the government and the opposition for that matter admitted that the banks do have some justification, or did, in raising rates?
Well, I think it's a bit hard for the Commonwealth Bank to be crying poor. My recollection is that they made a $6 billion cash profit during the course of this year, and that Mr Norris enjoys an annual salary in excess of $16 million. So I don't accept that the banks should be crying poor. I think all the external evidence suggests that bank margins are higher than they need to be given the cost of lending, and that it's appropriate for the government to intervene on the side of home borrowers by ruling out exit fees from the 1st of July next year.
Gary, do you accept what Ralph Norris said, that they, and all the three of the four bank CEOs have appeared so far, they've all said they had justification to increase their rates?
Well, I'm not arguing, and the coalition's not arguing, that there should be gross interference by federal government in setting rates or controlling the movements and decisions of banks or lending institutions. What we do see, though, is the need for further involvement in creating a more competitive market. That's the bottom line with all of this reform, whether it's the government's or it's ours. It's about making our market more competitive. When there are only four major players, four major pillars of the housing sector, you do need to make sure that you've got more competition than otherwise would occur, and that's why measures like this need to be considered. It is important that we put pressure on banks to justify what they do, and to keep the pressure on them to keep those rates as low as possible, and for government to make decisions that dovetails with that approach, which doesn't put pressure itself on interest rates to go up higher than they need to be.
Again, all bank CEOs who've appeared before this inquiry have made the point their margins have actually come down. They're lower than they are in the United States. And do we want to go to a system there? When you talk about competition, are you talking about competition for competition's sake, when in fact what we have is a strong, stable banking system that's actually made its way through the GFC?
We've got certainly, very large profits being made, as Kelvin Thomson points out, by our banks. They're not exactly institutions that are struggling to survive in a market like they face at the moment. But everyone admits that there are ways in which you can improve the outlook for people who are trying to borrow money at an affordable rate and retain an interest rate projection which is not going to cripple them in the future. That's what we're all looking for, and I think it's possible to do that if we have a light touch regulation which effectively achieves a level of control over what's going on in competition terms in the marketplace to keep ourselves moving forward. The government's got a plan, it's put on the table now. It's getting some flack from this inquiry. Some of the smaller players, as you point out, Gillian, aren't very comfortable with it. They need to be comfortable with it because they're the ones who are going to deliver the competition, apparently, that's going to provide for a bit of competition with the larger lenders. But until we do put that extra competition into the marketplace, clearly we're facing the prospect of higher than necessary interest rate rises in the future.
Kelvin Thomson, I want to ask you, Wayne Swan did make the statement on Sunday when he released this package that it would lead to lower interest rates over time. Are you happy to tell your constituents, in fact, that this package will do that?
Well, I think that what the package does is put downward pressure on interest rates by making it possible for borrowers to move from one financial product to another without penalty. I think it's inevitable that will act in a way which helps home borrowers, and so I'm highly supportive of it. And we're doing that in the context of providing a strong, stable financial system. We did that during the global financial crisis, and we're continuing to do it.
Kelvin, I want to ask you about the BER, because the report, a final report came down today into the BER. While Brad Orgel is saying some improvement has been made in this schools hall scheme since the interim report came down, it still shows that there are a substantial number of complaints coming in about the school system, even since all the publicity has been shone on it, that it's been an expensive way of putting stimulus into the economy. Do you admit that it's, in hindsight, things could have been better done?
Well, Gillian, I'm a great supporter of the Building the Education Revolution scheme. It has put into my electorate of Wills over $100 million. It is the biggest capital investment by any government any time in my electorate, and through the last few months I've been visiting many local primary schools which have done terrific things with that money. They are delighted with what it's been able to do to rejuvenate and renovate buildings which date back to the 1950s, 1940s, and was seriously in need of a facelift.
Value
it really
for money,
has
though?
done. I believe so. It has done terrific things for schools in my electorate, and all the school communities I talk to are delighted with it.
What's the ACT feedback?
In the ACT, I have to admit, we've done reasonably well in terms of getting good value for money. It doesn't appear to be, though, the typical story around Australia. The stories of waste are just too numerous to discount. Look, you can stimulate the economy by standing on a building in Martin Plaza and throwing money off the top. It doesn't make it good value for money or return a good dividend to the taxpayers who put that money there in the first place. We need to ask ourselves whether we couldn't have done this better. That's the critical question here. The government deserves credit for improving school halls and libraries, but how they've done it has to be questioned at the same time. And I think there's simply too much evidence out there at the moment, Gillian, that this has been done in a ham-fisted way. It's led to great waste, and we could have spent that money on other things to do very important, valuable things for our community if we hadn't wasted so much money on BER. For example, saving the Australian War Memorial from having to consider closing its doors one day a week.
Gary Humphries, I'd like your prediction for 2011. Do you think the Gillard government will go the distance?
Well, I think that it will, mainly, Gillian, because the people who are its allies in both chambers of the Parliament need to depend on it surviving to survive in their roles to some extent into the future. But it will absolutely have to put some policies on the table to justify the basis of forming a government after the August election. At this stage, we simply don't have policies in key areas of government policy making, things like asylum seekers, things like keeping the cost of living down, rising costs of housing, fuel, interest rates, etc. All those things are simply not addressed by this government. Until we get those answers, we're, in a sense, working, all of us, in a vacuum, not knowing what the government's going to do about the big issues facing Australia. Kelvin
Thomson, you've taken aim at the Victorian government's, or the former Victorian government's campaign, I should say, Labor's campaign in Victoria, why they lost the election down there. Some of those very same issues would apply to your federal government, I'm sure you admit. Do you think your federal government has lost its way a bit, and do you think you'll make it through a full term?
Well, I certainly see no reason why we won't make it through full term. You've seen the Parliament working during the last few months. You've seen legislation being passed. There's no doubt that cost of living pressures are important. And those cost of living pressures are being driven by runaway population growth. We've had record high levels of net migration. I believe they need to be pulled back, and I believe they're the things that have been driving cost of living pressures. Next year, as the Prime Minister says, should be a year of decision and delivery, and there are important issues like those of tackling climate change, solving the problems of the Murray-Darling Basin, dealing with issues of population growth that I see as being on the agenda, on the radar for next year.
Well, I look forward to discussing both of those with you then. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Nice to talk with you.